Picture this. You're standing at the gates of your city when a messenger arrives bearing news that will drain the color from your face. The banners on the horizon don't belong to any ordinary army. They belong to a man whose very name makes hardened warriors weep like children, a man who has turned entire civilizations into monuments of bone and ash, a man who gave his soldiers a simple choice: bring me 2 human heads by sunset or lose your own. This isn't the story of some mythical beast or fictional tyrant. This is the true account of Timur, known to history as Tamerlane. While most people remember Genghis Khan as history's ultimate conqueror, they've forgotten someone far worse, someone who made the great Khan's brutality look like child's play, someone who turned mass murder into an exact science, complete with quotas and architectural blueprints drawn in blood. By the time we finish exploring this nightmare, you'll understand why entire populations chose suicide over surrender when they saw his approach. You'll discover how a crippled cattle thief from the wastelands of Central Asia managed to terrorize 3 continents simultaneously. Most importantly, you'll learn why historians estimate that this one man was personally responsible for eliminating 5% of the entire world's population during his lifetime. But before we dive into the oceans of blood, we need to understand the world that created this monster. We're talking about the 14th century, a time when the great Mongol Empire had crumbled into competing fragments. The descendants of Genghis Khan were busy fighting each other over the scraps of their ancestors' legacy, leaving vast territories without effective leadership. In this power vacuum, ambitious warlords carved out their own kingdoms through violence and cunning. Central Asia had become a battlefield where survival depended on how fast you could ride and how accurately you could shoot a bow from horseback. It was here, in the Chagatai Khanate, that a young man named Timur learned the brutal arithmetic of power. He wasn't born into royalty or blessed with divine right. He was nothing more than a minor noble's son in a world where weakness meant death. The injury that would define his entire life came early. While attempting to steal livestock, arrows pierced his right leg and damaged his right hand, leaving him permanently disabled. In a culture that valued physical prowess above all else, these wounds should have marked the end of his story. A lame man couldn't ride effectively, couldn't draw a bow properly, couldn't command respect from warriors who lived and died by their physical capabilities. But Timur possessed something far more dangerous than physical strength, a mind that could turn disadvantage into deadly advantage. What happened next reveals the true nature of this future destroyer of nations. Instead of accepting his limitations, Timur began studying the psychology of fear with the dedication of a scholar. He observed how terror could accomplish what armies could not. He watched how the mere reputation for cruelty could open city gates without a single siege weapon. Most crucially, he understood that in a world where power came from the barrel of a sword, the man who could inspire the most fear would ultimately rule. His early career reads like a manual for ambitious psychopaths. Timur aligned himself with a warlord named Hussein, providing military genius in exchange for legitimacy and resources. Together, they swept across the fragmented territories of Transoxiana, eliminating rivals with methodical precision. But partnership requires trust. And trust was a luxury Timur couldn't afford. The moment that truly reveals Timur's character came when his alliance with Hussein inevitably soured. Power, as they say, doesn't share the throne willingly. When Hussein attempted to marginalize his crippled partner, Timur responded with a masterstroke of calculated brutality that would become his signature. He cornered Hussein in the city of Balkh and offered terms of surrender that seemed almost generous. Hussein's life would be spared, and no blood would be shed in his execution. Hussein, desperate and with few options, accepted these terms. What happened next demonstrates the twisted logic that would guide Timur's entire career. Technically keeping his promise, Timur ordered his men to avoid using bladed weapons. Instead, they strangled Hussein with ropes and then trampled his body under horses' hooves until nothing remained but pulverized bone and meat. No blood had been spilled, just as promised. The promise had been kept to the letter while being violated in spirit. This wasn't simple cruelty for its own sake. It was a calculated message to anyone who might consider betraying him in the future. Timur wanted the world to know that his promises came with hidden clauses written in the blood of those foolish enough to trust him completely. More importantly, he was establishing a pattern that would define his reign, the systematic use of terror as a governing tool. With Hussein eliminated, Timur faced his greatest challenge yet. He lacked the royal bloodline necessary to claim supreme authority in the Mongol successor states. Only descendants of Genghis Khan could legitimately rule as Great Khan, and Timur's lineage was decidedly common. Lesser men might have given up at this point, accepting their place in the hierarchy. But Timur had already proven he wasn't bound by conventional limitations. His solution was brilliant in its cynical simplicity. He married Hussein's widow, a princess with direct descent from Genghis Khan himself. This marriage transformed him from a successful warlord into the Gurgen, the imperial son-in-law. While he couldn't claim the throne directly, he could rule from behind it, placing puppet khans on the ceremonial seat while wielding actual power as the emir. The capital city of Samarkand became his obsession and his masterpiece. Timur envisioned it as the center of a new world empire, a jewel that would outshine Baghdad, Damascus, and Constantinople combined. But he wouldn't build this paradise through commerce or diplomacy. He would construct it with the forced labor of kidnapped artisans and the wealth stolen from conquered cities. This is where Timur's true genius becomes apparent. While other conquerors simply destroyed what they captured, Timur was building something unprecedented. Every campaign he launched had dual purposes: eliminate potential rivals and harvest the human resources needed for his grand project. Architects, mathematicians, craftsmen, and scholars were systematically separated from the general population during his conquests and transported back to Samarkand in chains. The first major test of his expanding ambitions came from an unexpected source. Toktamish, the leader of the Golden Horde that controlled much of Russia, had once been Timur's protege. Timur had helped him secure power, treated him as a son, and expected lifelong gratitude in return. But power corrupts even the most grateful students, and Toktamish began eyeing his former mentor's territories with growing hunger. The insult that triggered Timur's wrath came in 1382. Toktamish, emboldened by his successful sack of Moscow, began making demands of his former patron. He sent ambassadors to Samarkand with messages that bordered on threats, treating Timur as if he were a subordinate rather than an equal. For a man whose entire authority rested on the perception of absolute dominance, such disrespect couldn't be tolerated. Timur's response wasn't immediate anger, but cold calculation. He spent months preparing for what would become one of the most ambitious military campaigns in medieval history. The logistical challenges alone would have deterred most commanders. The Golden Horde's territory stretched across thousands of miles of steppes and forests, with no established supply lines and hostile weather conditions that killed armies more effectively than any enemy. But Timur had learned to turn disadvantages into weapons. He assembled an army of 100,000 men, not the disorganized horde typical of steppe warfare, but a professional military machine. These weren't raiders or tribal warriors fighting for glory and plunder. They were disciplined soldiers paid with the spoils of previous victories and bound to their commander by a combination of fear and genuine respect for his tactical brilliance. The pursuit of Toktamish across the frozen wastes of Russia became a masterclass in psychological warfare. Rather than simply chasing his enemy's army, Timur systematically destroyed the economic infrastructure that supported the Golden Horde. He burned settlements, slaughtered livestock, and poisoned wells, creating a wasteland where no army could survive for long. Meanwhile, his own forces lived off carefully planned supply caches and the systematic hunting of wild game. When the two armies finally met at the Conqueror River in 1391, the battle that followed lasted 3 days and involved nearly 200,000 combatants. The sound of clashing weapons could be heard for miles, and the ground became so soaked with blood that horses slipped and fell while trying to maneuver. At the crucial moment, when Timur's forces were beginning to waver under the ferocious assault of Tokhtamish's cavalry, something extraordinary happened. The aging, crippled commander dismounted his horse, grabbed a battle axe, and limped directly into the front lines of combat. Here was a man who could barely walk without assistance, throwing himself into hand-to-hand combat against warriors half his age. The psychological impact on both armies was immediate and decisive. His own men, seeing their elderly leader fighting like a berserker despite his physical limitations, found reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. Meanwhile, Tokhtamish's warriors found themselves demoralized by the sight of an old cripple who refused to die. The Golden Horde's army didn't just lose the battle, it ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. But Timur's revenge extended far beyond military victory. He ordered the complete destruction of Sarai, the Golden Horde's capital city, going so far as to divert a river to ensure the site could never be rebuilt. He systematically dismantled the northern trade routes that had made the Golden Horde wealthy, forcing all commercial traffic through his own southern territories. Tokhtamish himself escaped the immediate slaughter, but spent the remainder of his life as a hunted fugitive, hiding in the forests of Siberia, while Timur's agents pursued him relentlessly. The man who had dared to threaten the lame conqueror died in exile, forgotten by his former subjects and abandoned by his allies. This campaign established the pattern that would define Timur's career for the next 3 decades. He wasn't simply conquering territory, he was rewriting the rules of power itself. Traditional concepts of mercy, honor, and proportional response meant nothing to him. Every slight demanded overwhelming retaliation. Every enemy needed to be not just defeated, but obliterated so completely that future generations would remember the consequences of resistance. The wealth and captives taken from the Golden Horde campaign funded Timur's next target, the fractured kingdoms of Persia. Here lay cities filled with accumulated riches from centuries of trade along the Silk Road, governed by rulers too divided and weak to mount effective resistance. For a man building his vision of a perfect capital, Persia represented an irresistible treasure house waiting to be emptied. The Persian campaign that followed would forever change how the world understood the meaning of terror. Unlike his previous conquests, which had been driven by political necessity or personal vendetta, Timur's invasion of Persia was pure predation. Here were cities that had grown fat and complacent on centuries of trade wealth, ruled by sultans more interested in poetry than warfare, defended by armies that hadn't faced a real threat in generations. The city of Isfahan made what seemed like a reasonable decision when Timur's forces appeared at their gates in 1387. They calculated the odds, examined their defenses, and chose pragmatic submission over heroic destruction. The gates opened, tribute was paid, and Timur's representatives took control of the city's administration. For the citizens of Isfahan, it appeared they had successfully navigated a dangerous situation through wise compromise. This illusion of safety lasted exactly 1 year. A single spark of rebellion, lit by a blacksmith who refused to pay Timur's crushing taxes, ignited a citywide uprising that massacred every one of Timur's administrators and soldiers left behind. The rebels celebrated their liberation in the streets, convinced they had struck a blow for freedom that would inspire similar revolts across the region. They had no idea they had just signed their own death warrants, in the most literal sense possible. When news of the rebellion reached Timur's camp, his reaction wasn't the explosive rage his subordinates expected. Instead, witnesses described an eerie calm settling over the commander as he absorbed the details of what had happened. He asked quiet questions about numbers, timing, and methods. He inquired about the fate of specific individuals. Then, he turned to his maps and began planning what would become history's most methodical urban massacre. The army that returned to Isfahan wasn't coming to reconquer the city. They were coming to conduct an experiment in applied terror that would echo through the centuries. Timur had realized something that would define military thinking for generations to come. The most effective weapon wasn't the sword or the siege engine, but the memory of what happened to those who dared resist. As his forces surrounded the city walls, Isfahan attempted to surrender again. Delegations of prominent citizens approached Timur's tent carrying keys to the gates, chests of gold, and promises of eternal loyalty. They offered tribute that exceeded their previous payments by enormous margins. They begged for the chance to prove their submission through any service he might demand. Timur listened to their pleas with apparent attention, nodding at appropriate moments and asking clarifying questions about their proposals. When they finished speaking, he thanked them for their time and dismissed them with what seemed like consideration for their offers. Then he turned to his generals and issued orders that would transform administrative efficiency into an instrument of horror. Every soldier in the army, from the lowest foot soldier to the highest ranking officer, received identical instructions. By sunset of the following day, each man was required to present 2 severed human heads to the counting stations being established around the city. The heads didn't need to belong to enemy combatants or resistance leaders. Any human head would satisfy the quota. Age, gender, and social status were irrelevant factors in this grim arithmetic. The psychological impact of this order on Timur's own forces was immediate and devastating. These weren't bloodthirsty savages eager for slaughter. Many were professional soldiers who had families of their own back in Samarkand. They understood the difference between combat killing and murder, and what their commander was ordering clearly fell into the latter category. But they also understood the consequences of failing to meet his demands. What happened next reveals the systematic way Timur had conditioned his army to prioritize obedience over conscience. Initially, many soldiers attempted to avoid personally committing atrocities by purchasing heads from more willing comrades. A macabre marketplace emerged within the military camp, where human heads became currency traded between men desperate to avoid becoming executioners themselves. The price fluctuations in this market of death provided a grotesque lesson in supply and demand economics. Early in the day, heads commanded premium prices as squeamish soldiers paid whatever was necessary to avoid bloodying their own hands. But, as the sunset deadline approached and supply remained limited, the cost became prohibitive for all but the wealthiest officers. Faced with the choice between financial ruin and moral compromise, most soldiers chose survival over principle. They discovered that ordinary people, when placed under sufficient pressure, could commit acts they would have considered unthinkable under normal circumstances. The city's population became raw material for meeting quotas rather than human beings deserving of mercy or consideration. The systematic nature of what followed defied every convention of medieval warfare. This wasn't the chaotic slaughter that typically accompanied the sack of a city. It was organized, methodical, and documented with bureaucratic precision. Counting stations operated like administrative offices, processing the delivery of heads with the same efficiency used for managing supply inventories. By the end of that single day, 70,000 people had been decapitated in accordance with Timur's quota system. But the true genius of his psychological warfare became apparent in what happened to those severed heads. Rather than leaving them to rot or disposing of them in mass graves, Timur ordered them to be incorporated into a construction project that would serve as a permanent advertisement for his methods. Teams of engineers and architects, many of them kidnapped from previous conquests, were put to work designing and building massive towers constructed entirely from human skulls. These weren't crude piles of bones thrown together in haste. They were carefully planned monuments, built with mortar and engineering principles to ensure structural stability and longevity. 28 of these skull towers rose around Isfahan's perimeter, each one containing thousands of heads arranged in artistic patterns that demonstrated both technical skill and profound psychological understanding. The empty eye sockets stared outward in all directions, creating an effect that visitors described as being watched by an army of the dead. The message encoded in these monuments was clear to anyone who witnessed them. Timur wasn't just capable of mass murder. He had the organizational skills, technical resources, and absolute authority necessary to transform mass murder into public art. He could take human tragedy and reshape it into architectural statements that would outlast the lives of everyone who opposed him. News of Isfahan's fate spread across the known world with the speed that only true horror can achieve. Merchants, pilgrims, and diplomatic envoys carried detailed descriptions of the skull towers to every major city, from Istanbul to Delhi. The stories grew in the telling, but the basic facts were so overwhelming that embellishment seemed unnecessary. The psychological impact of these accounts extended far beyond military considerations. Rulers who had never heard of Timur suddenly found themselves studying maps to determine how far their kingdoms lay from his expanding territory. City councils that had operated for centuries without considering external military threats began debating surrender protocols for conflicts that hadn't even begun. More importantly, the Isfahan massacre established a new category of strategic thinking that would influence warfare for generations. Traditional military theory focused on defeating enemy armies through superior tactics, better equipment, or numerical advantages. Timur had proven that the most devastating victories could be achieved by targeting civilian populations in ways so horrific that future enemies would surrender rather than risk similar treatment. The economic implications of his methods were equally revolutionary. Siege warfare typically required enormous expenditures of time, resources, and manpower to achieve uncertain results. Even successful sieges often left the conquering army weakened and the captured city damaged beyond immediate usefulness. Timur's approach eliminated these inefficiencies by making resistance so costly that rational opponents would choose immediate submission over prolonged conflict. This calculated approach to terror would define the remainder of his career as he turned his attention toward increasingly ambitious targets. The fragmented states of Persia had been merely a training exercise for what he now envisioned as his destiny: the conquest of the three greatest powers of his era. To the north lay the Golden Horde's successors, still reeling from their previous defeat, but far from completely subdued. To the west waited the rising Ottoman Empire, whose young sultan considered himself the heir to Roman greatness. And far to the east lay the ultimate prize, the Ming dynasty of China, whose wealth and prestige exceeded everything else in the known world. Each of these powers commanded resources that dwarfed anything Timur had faced before. Their armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their territories stretched across vast distances that would challenge any supply system. And their rulers possessed both the experience and motivation necessary to mount serious resistance to his expansion. Traditional military wisdom suggested that attempting to fight all three simultaneously would be strategic suicide. But Timur had already proven that traditional wisdom meant nothing when applied to unconventional methods. The skull towers of Isfahan had taught him that reputation could accomplish what armies could not. The mere possibility of suffering similar treatment would influence enemy decision-making in ways that no amount of conventional military pressure could achieve. The question facing him now wasn't whether he could defeat these powers through traditional conquest. It was whether he could terrify them into submission through demonstrations of controlled brutality so overwhelming that resistance would seem pointless. The answer would reshape the political landscape of three continents and establish precedents for state-sponsored terror that would echo through the centuries. As Timur's forces prepared for these expanded campaigns, observers noted changes in both the scale and sophistication of his military organization. This was no longer the relatively modest army that had emerged from Central Asian tribal conflicts. It had evolved into something unprecedented, a professional war machine specifically designed to implement systematic terror as a governing strategy across multiple theaters of operations simultaneously. The transformation was visible in every aspect of his military apparatus. Gone were the days when Timur commanded a collection of tribal warriors bound together by personal loyalty and the promise of plunder. What emerged from the steppes of Central Asia was something far more sinister, a machine built specifically for the industrial production of fear. His army now functioned with the precision of a well-oiled administrative system. Specialized units handled different aspects of terror implementation. Engineers focused on siege warfare and monument construction using human remains. Intelligence operatives infiltrated target cities months before actual invasion, identifying key infrastructure and influential citizens who might organize resistance. Most disturbing of all, psychological warfare specialists studied the cultural and religious sensitivities of different populations to maximize the emotional impact of their methods. The logistics alone represented a revolution in military thinking. Traditional armies lived off the land through foraging and pillaging, making them dependent on local resources and weather conditions. Timur's forces traveled with supply trains that could sustain operations across vast distances for extended periods. They carried not just weapons and food, but the tools necessary for constructing their signature monuments of terror. Portable workshops accompanied the main force, staffed by craftsmen whose sole purpose was maintaining the equipment used for mass executions and skull tower construction. These weren't improvised operations conducted in the heat of conquest. They were planned industrial processes designed to transform human populations into architectural statements with maximum efficiency. The psychological conditioning of his soldiers had reached levels that bordered on the supernatural. Through a combination of religious indoctrination, financial incentives, and systematic desensitization to violence, Timur had created warriors who could transition seamlessly between normal human behavior and methodical mass murder. They could share meals and jokes with their comrades, then spend the afternoon systematically decapitating civilians without apparent emotional distress. This conditioning process began during recruitment and continued throughout their service. New soldiers were gradually exposed to increasing levels of violence, starting with witnessing executions and progressing to active participation in atrocities. Those who showed signs of psychological breakdown were quietly transferred to non-combat roles or simply disappeared from the ranks. What remained was a core of men who had internalized Timur's worldview so completely that moral considerations no longer influenced their actions. The religious framework supporting this system deserves special attention because it reveals the sophisticated nature of Timur's psychological manipulation. He didn't simply ignore Islamic teachings about mercy and justice. He actively reinterpreted them to support his methods. Court scholars, many of them captured from conquered cities and working under threat of death, produced theological justifications for mass murder that satisfied his soldiers' need for moral legitimacy. These scholars argued that Timur's enemies were enemies of God, making their elimination a religious duty rather than a war crime. They developed complex theological arguments, proving that the destruction of resistant populations actually served divine will by removing obstacles to the establishment of proper Islamic governance. Most perversely, they claimed that the spectacular nature of Timur's punishments actually demonstrated mercy by deterring future conflicts that would cause even greater suffering. The soldiers embraced these justifications with the desperation of men who needed to sleep at night despite what they had done during the day. The alternative was confronting the reality that they had become willing participants in systematic genocide for no higher purpose than their commanders' megalomaniacal ambitions. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this transformation was how efficiently it operated. The skull towers of Isfahan hadn't been built through chaotic massacre, but through organized labor that met specific architectural requirements. Teams of soldiers worked with the same methodical approach they might use for any construction project, sorting heads by size and condition to ensure structural integrity, while creating aesthetically pleasing patterns. The speed of these operations defied conventional understanding of how long mass murder should take. 70,000 people had been killed and processed into building materials in a single day through what amounted to an assembly line approach to genocide. Each step of the process was optimized for efficiency, from the initial killing to the final placement of skulls in their designated positions within the tower structures. Contemporary observers struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. This wasn't the random violence typical of medieval warfare, where soldiers killed in the heat of battle or during the emotional aftermath of siege. It was cold, calculated, and executed with the same precision normally reserved for administrative tasks like tax collection or census taking. The documentation of these processes reveals Timur's understanding that terror required careful calibration to achieve maximum effectiveness. Too little violence and enemies might calculate they could survive resistance. Too much violence and populations might choose death over submission, eliminating the economic benefits of conquest. The optimal level of brutality needed to inspire complete submission without destroying the human resources necessary for rebuilding under his rule. This calculation extended to every aspect of his campaign planning. Intelligence reports assessed not just military capabilities, but psychological vulnerabilities of target populations. What cultural symbols held special significance? Which religious sites commanded the deepest reverence? How could these elements be incorporated into terror demonstrations that would resonate most powerfully with local sensitivities? The siege of Baghdad in 1401 provided the perfect laboratory for testing these refined methods. The city represented everything Timur despised about established power: ancient prestige, accumulated wealth, and the comfortable assumption that cultural significance provided protection from barbarian violence. Baghdad's rulers had grown soft through centuries of prosperity, trusting in their city's legendary reputation rather than maintaining adequate defenses. When Timur's forces appeared at the gates, the initial negotiations followed familiar patterns. The city offered tribute, promised submission, and requested reasonable terms for surrender. These discussions dragged on for weeks while both sides maneuvered for advantage. Baghdad's leaders hoped relief forces might arrive, or that Timur might accept payment and move on to easier targets. Timur used the delay to study the city's defenses and plan the demonstration that would define his legacy. The breakthrough came when his engineers identified a weakness in the city's water supply system. By controlling access to fresh water, they could force surrender without the expense and risk of direct assault. But Timur had no interest in conventional siege tactics. He wanted Baghdad to serve as his masterpiece of terror, a demonstration so overwhelming that future enemies would surrender at the mere mention of his name. The psychological warfare began before any violence occurred. Timur ordered the construction of a massive wooden platform within sight of the city walls. Day by day, his soldiers built what appeared to be a stage for some unknown performance. The citizens of Baghdad watched with growing unease as the structure took shape, its purpose unclear, but its scale ominous. When construction was complete, Timur's herald announced that the platform would host a demonstration of what awaited cities that forced him to waste time on sieges. The performance would begin at dawn and continue until the city surrendered unconditionally. No tribute would be accepted, no negotiations entertained, no mercy shown until the gates opened and the keys were delivered to his tent. What followed redefined the boundaries of calculated cruelty. Prisoners captured during the approach to Baghdad were brought to the platform in groups of 100. There, in full view of the city's defenders, they were systematically executed using methods designed for maximum psychological impact rather than efficiency. The process was slow, deliberate, and accompanied by detailed explanations of what each execution method represented. The herald announced that the current victims represented the fate awaiting Baghdad's soldiers. The next group demonstrated what would happen to government officials. A third group showed the destiny of religious leaders who had failed to counsel immediate surrender. Each category of victim faced different execution methods, all of them designed to communicate specific messages about the consequences of continued resistance. The platform became a theatre where death was transformed into performance art. The timing was carefully choreographed to maintain maximum psychological pressure without allowing audiences to become desensitized through repetition. Periods of intense violence alternated with breaks during which the implications of what they had witnessed could fully sink in. The citizens of Baghdad found themselves trapped in a nightmare where their own survival depended on watching the systematic murder of people who shared their religion, their language, and often their family connections. The psychological torture was deliberate and sophisticated, designed to break their will to resist through overwhelming demonstration of their helplessness. On the third day of these demonstrations, as the pile of corpses beneath the platform grew high enough to attract clouds of carrion birds, Baghdad's gates finally opened. The surrender was unconditional, accompanied by pleas for mercy that revealed the complete psychological breakdown of the city's leadership. They offered everything they possessed in exchange for an end to the demonstrations. Timur accepted their surrender with apparent magnanimity, promising that the killing would stop immediately and that Baghdad's citizens would be treated according to Islamic law. The platform was dismantled, the corpses buried, and normal military occupation procedures implemented. For several days, it seemed that Baghdad had successfully navigated the crisis through timely submission. The illusion of safety was shattered when Timur announced his intention to commemorate his victory with a monument worthy of Baghdad's historical significance. The city's residents assumed this meant a traditional victory column or mosque complex that would honor his conquest while providing local employment for craftsmen and laborers. Instead, they discovered that they themselves would serve as the raw materials for this monument. The quota system pioneered at Isfahan was implemented with industrial efficiency, refined through years of practice. Every soldier received assignments based on their rank and experience, with officers responsible for larger numbers than common troops. The mathematical precision was horrifying in its bureaucratic normalcy. The resulting massacre dwarfed even Isfahan in its scope and systematic nature. 90,000 heads were harvested in a single day through an operation that resembled a macabre factory more than a military action. The processing stations operated around the clock, with teams working in shifts to maintain optimal efficiency throughout the killing period. The monument that rose from this slaughter represented the pinnacle of Timur's architectural terrorism. Unlike the relatively simple towers constructed at Isfahan, the Baghdad installation was a complex of interconnected structures that dominated the city's skyline. The design incorporated sophisticated engineering principles to ensure stability while creating visual effects that could be seen from miles away. The construction process itself served as an additional layer of psychological warfare. Citizens who had survived the initial massacre were forced to participate in building the monument, handling the skulls of their neighbors, friends, and family members. The work continued for weeks under armed guard, with additional executions conducted whenever construction schedules fell behind or workers showed signs of resistance. The completed monument stood as testimony to what industrialized terror could accomplish when directed by unlimited ambition and unconstrained by moral considerations. Visitors from across the known world came to witness what human organization could achieve when devoted entirely to the production of fear rather than the creation of beauty or utility. The psychological impact extended far beyond Baghdad's borders. Trade routes that had operated for centuries shifted to avoid the city entirely, not from practical concerns about safety, but from the spiritual contamination associated with witnessing such concentrated evil. The monument had transformed Baghdad from a center of commerce and learning into a pilgrimage site for those who needed to understand the absolute limits of human cruelty. Yet even this achievement failed to satisfy Timur's expanding appetite for recognition. The old conqueror, now approaching 70 and increasingly troubled by the physical disabilities that had marked his entire life, turned his attention to the ultimate prize that had obsessed every steppe warrior since the time of Genghis Khan himself. China represented everything that Central Asian nomads both envied and despised about settled civilization. The Ming dynasty commanded wealth that made Persian and Arab treasures seem insignificant by comparison. Their armies numbered in the millions, supported by industrial production capabilities that could manufacture weapons and equipment on scales impossible for nomadic societies to match. More importantly, China represented the source of legitimacy that could transform Timur from a successful warlord into a figure of truly historical significance. The mandate of heaven, the divine approval that legitimized Chinese dynasties, had been claimed by Mongol conquerors before. If Timur could repeat that achievement, he would surpass even Genghis Khan in the scope of his accomplishments. The preparation for this ultimate campaign required mobilization on a scale that strained even Timur's sophisticated military apparatus. 200,000 soldiers assembled in Samarkand during the winter of 1404, accompanied by support personnel, siege equipment, and the logistical infrastructure necessary for operations across thousands of miles of hostile territory. The army that prepared to march on China represented the culmination of Timur's lifetime of military innovation. These weren't tribal warriors fighting for glory and plunder, but professional soldiers whose entire careers had been devoted to implementing systematic terror as an instrument of state policy. They carried with them not just weapons, but the institutional knowledge necessary for transforming conquered populations into architectural materials for monument construction. But even as this ultimate army prepared for deployment, age and accumulated injuries were finally extracting their price from the commander who had defied physical limitations throughout his career. The man who had once dismounted to fight on foot during crucial battles now required assistance simply to mount his horse. The hands that had personally wielded axes in combat could barely hold a pen steady enough to sign orders. The irony was impossible to ignore. Just as Timur approached the achievement that would crown his lifetime of conquest, his body was failing him in ways that no amount of willpower could overcome. The disabilities that had shaped his entire approach to power were finally asserting absolute dominance over the mind that had spent decades refusing to acknowledge their limitations. On February 19th, 1405, in a frozen tent on the banks of the Sia Daria River, the most feared man in human history drew his final breath. Timur had spent his last moments raving about the conquest of Beijing, issuing orders to generals who weren't there, commanding armies that existed only in his fever dreams. The body that had survived arrows, swords, and countless battles finally surrendered to an enemy it couldn't intimidate or torture into submission. His death triggered the immediate collapse of everything he had built through 4 decades of systematic terror. Without his terrifying presence to hold it together, the empire fractured instantly. His sons and grandsons turned on each other like wolves, dividing the conquered territories through civil wars that lasted for generations. The man who had eliminated 5% of the world's population left behind no lasting institutions, no code of laws, no functioning government, only pyramids of skulls that would crumble to dust, and a reputation that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who truly understands what organized evil can accomplish. The final judgment on Timur's legacy isn't found in the monuments he built or the cities he conquered, but in the silence that followed his campaigns. Entire regions of Asia fell so quiet that travelers reported hearing nothing but wind whistling through empty eye sockets. He had proven that a single human being, driven by unlimited ambition and unrestrained by moral considerations, could literally reshape the demographics of continents through the systematic application of terror. Today, his tomb in Samarkand remains sealed beneath a massive jade stone inscribed with a warning that has proven prophetic across the centuries. When I rise from the dead, the world will tremble. Perhaps the most terrifying truth about Tamerlane is that his methods never truly died with him. They simply waited in the darkness of human nature, ready to emerge whenever someone else decides that fear is more efficient than justice, that terror is more reliable than law, and that the systematic destruction of human dignity is an acceptable price for absolute power.